Thank you all for being here at this briefing, Deregulatory Disasters, Americans Harmed by Deregulation Speak Out Against the Regulatory Accountability Act. I am Rachel Weintraub, Legislative Director and General Counsel with Consumer Federation of America, and I lead the lobby team and am a member of the Executive Committee of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards, or CSS, which is hosting this event. CSS is an alliance of more than 150 consumer, small business, labor, scientific, research, good government, faith, community, health, environmental, and public interest groups representing millions of Americans. We are joined in the belief that our country's system of regulatory safeguards should provide a stable framework that secures our quality of life, paves the way for a sound economy, and benefits us all. I would like to thank the Economic Policy Institute for hosting us today and for all of their work and support in this event. I would also like to thank Americans for Financial Reform, the Environmental Working Group, Union of Concerned Scientists, Kids and Cars, Environmental Defense Fund, Public Citizen, and my colleagues at Consumer Federation of America for all of their work in preparation for today's event. I'd also like to remind everyone that we are live tweeting at the hashtags HurtByDeregulation and GoAwayRAA. This morning, we are here to discuss the very real and significant consequences of deregulation. As a country, we depend on rules to make our lives safer, healthier, and more fair. However, there are numerous efforts under consideration by Congress that will make it vastly more difficult, if not impossible, for rules that we need and expect to ever be finalized. The Regulatory Accountability Act is one of the most pernicious of these bills. The bill passed the House in January and was voted out of committee in the Senate this past May. This bill in the Senate is S-951, and it is a threat to the rules that we all care about. The RAA would handcuff all federal agencies in their efforts to protect consumers, workers, and the environment. It prioritizes regulatory costs over regulatory effectiveness, adds burdensome new analytical requirements, and makes the rulemaking process more adversarial, favoring those powerful special interest groups with the resources to make the system work to their benefit. The RAA would override important bipartisan laws that have been in effect for years, as well as those more recently enacted to protect consumers from unfair and deceptive financial services, unsafe food, and unsafe consumer products, for example. The RAA would infuse obstacles into the regulatory process. It prioritizes costs over benefits. The RAA would require all agencies, regardless of their statutorily mandated missions, to adopt the most cost-effective alternative when issuing major or high-impact rules, and the administrator of the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, has discretion to categorize rules if they have an impact on competition, for example. This would significantly override important bipartisan laws that have been in effect for years, as well as more recently enacted laws to protect consumers from unfair and deceptive financial practices, unsafe food, and unsafe consumer products. Many consumer protection agencies have missions to protect consumers in various ways. The RAA would preempt those missions by prioritizing the most cost-effective alternative over the most consumer protective. Further, cost-effective is not even defined in the RAA, leaving a critical term ambiguous and likely up to years of litigation to decipher. The RAA requires extensive new analysis that will paralyze agencies. The RAA would create dozens of new analytical and procedural requirements that all agencies must conduct before issuing protective safeguards. These time-consuming, burdensome, resource-intensive, often one-sided requirements would not necessarily improve the quality of the agency decision-making process, but rather add extensive delay or complete paralysis to the promulgation of safeguards that Americans expect and rely upon to protect their families. The RAA would also make the rulemaking process more adversarial and less accessible. The RAA would make it harder for the public, including consumers and consumer organizations and public interest organizations, to participate in the rulemaking process by requiring adversarial hearing procedures called formal rulemaking for the most significant rulemakings. The RAA would also make independent agencies less independent, undermining their expertise. The RAA would tie the hands of independent agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which were specifically created to be outside of the political cabinet-level agencies for the purpose of ensuring that the expertise of those agencies would guide decision-making. And finally, the RAA creates more opportunities for those opposed to consumer and environmental and worker protections to intervene and delay or thwart the rulemaking process. The RAA would empower those opposed to rules that regulate their industry to intervene in the regulatory process through suing the agency. The deference that judges have generally afforded to agencies that require scientific and particular expertise would be undermined by the RAA's provision that empowers judges to intervene and use their judgment over that of agency experts. This will lead to more litigation and more rules overturned in court as judges increasingly second-guess science and expertise-based agency decision-making to protect the public. Our speakers this morning will share their experiences with you that compel the need for more regulation and not less, as would be the consequences of the RAA. I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. First, Amber Adamastos is from Portland, Oregon, and will discuss how she was denied justice due to forced arbitration. Our second speaker is Penny Dryden. She's from Wilmington, Delaware, and she will discuss how our community suffers from industrial and chemical pollution. Our third speaker, Dr. Paul Brooks, is from Vienna, West Virginia, and will discuss how his community suffers from contaminated water. Christy Christofferson is from Bend, Oregon, and she will discuss how her then 10-month-old son became sick with salmonella from eating a toddler snack. Our fifth speaker is Mr. Timothy Frink from Hollywood, Maryland, and he will discuss the need for window blind safety and the tragedy his family is enduring after the strangulation death of his 3-year-old granddaughter from a window blind cord. And our sixth speaker is Mr. Miles Harrison from Percival, Virginia, whose 20-month-old son died in a hot car. Our speakers will take questions at the end of all of the presentations. Thank you very much, and I now turn to Amber.
Hello. My name is Amber Adamastos. I come from a small, semi-rural community in Southern Oregon, where I lived with my mother, as well as San Diego, where I lived with my father. My mother worked as a bookkeeper. My father set tile. Neither of my parents went to college. When I began my studies in 2003, I discovered that I knew very little about the world, much less about how it worked or what was possible within it. I wanted to study every subject and take classes in every department. But the university universe and its bureaucracy was a bit overwhelming, so I transferred to a community college, where I attended part-time while working at a coffee shop. Back then, I didn't know how my degree would translate to a career, but I was convinced that earning any degree would guarantee me a decent, well-paying job. By 2008, the mistaken yet common illusion I had held about my job prospects had been completely dashed. I had only just transferred back to university, yet felt the urge to get out before acquiring further debt. However, in the fervor of my earlier idealism, I had taken courses in so many different subjects that I wasn't anywhere close to fulfilling the requirements of any single major. I left without finishing my degree in 2010. At that time, I was scared to take on more debt and decided instead to try to find honest work until the economy recovered a bit. After a few years of working low-paying jobs, I finally returned and obtained my Bachelor of Arts in 2013. That same year, I enrolled in a graduate-level program at the University of Pennsylvania. I believed with all my heart that a master's degree from such a well-known and well-respected institution would at least get me work that paid above the poverty line, and was therefore worth the money invested. I loved Penn and even achieved straight A's my first semester. But by the beginning of my second semester in 2014, I could no longer defer my previous student loans, and I was forced to drop out when I couldn't make my student loan payments, which were then up to $2,000 per month. I returned home, absolutely dejected, to move back in with my family at age 31. After months of being hounded by dozens of collection agencies over the phone and through the mail, I filed for bankruptcy later that year. It was a devastating experience to go from so much hope and excitement for the future to feeling like I was completely out of options. In 2016, a bankruptcy judge decided that being forced to repay my loans at that point would cause an undue hardship. So it was ruled that some of my loans, including those held with Citibank, would be wiped out. The court granted me the ability to get out of default by setting up new repayment terms with private lenders, as well as for my federal loans with the Department of Education. You can imagine the sense of relief I felt at regaining control over my situation. After years of uncertainty and disappointment, I finally had the chance to set things right, get back on track, and lead a normal life. At the beginning of 2017, this year, my bankruptcy officially closed, and all of my creditors received notice of the judge's discharge order, including Citibank. The weight of the past 3 years was finally lifted, and I was free to reestablish myself, even as I faced the difficulty of having a bankruptcy on my record. But mere weeks after my discharge, Citibank ignored the order of the judge and turned me over to collections, threatening my fragile credit as well as my newfound stability if I didn't pay. Over the next few months, I received multiple collection letters and even found out that my boyfriend's grandmother had received a call. When the judge found out what Citibank did, he ordered the bank's lawyers to show cause why they shouldn't be held in contempt for ignoring his order. Instead of apologizing or explaining, Citibank's lawyers are now arguing that the judge has no power over them. Because Citibank buried a rip-off clause in the fine print of its loan agreement, their lawyers claim that any dispute related to my loan must be decided in secret and private arbitration proceedings, even though it has been discharged. In private arbitration, the judge would be powerless to enforce any of his orders. Instead, a private firm chosen by Citibank would decide what happens, and neither I nor the judge would be able to appeal their ruling. A new rule from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau addresses the widespread harm caused by forced arbitration. It would allow consumers like me to join together to challenge Citibank or other bank lenders in class action lawsuits when they break the law, rather than having to fight them one by one, like me, in secret arbitration. The rule also brings transparency to individual arbitration proceedings by creating a public record of claims and outcomes, ensuring banks and lenders cannot use these clauses to cover up their illegal behavior. However, Congress has moved to repeal this rule using an obscure tool called the Congressional Review Act. If passed, this resolution would strip consumers of their Seventh Amendment right to take banks to court and would even prevent the CFPB from ever issuing another rule to restrict forced arbitration. The resolution passed the House 2 weeks ago and needs just 51 votes to pass in the Senate. If the CFPB rule is repealed, companies like Citibank can profit from ignoring the lawful orders of judges that my tax dollars pay for and operate outside of the law in a private justice system. We can't allow powerful corporations to hurt consumers like me, real people, like all of us on this stage, by simply opting out of state and federal laws. Yet, even if Congress chooses to leave this particular rule alone, the Regulatory Accountability Act would block agencies, including the CFPB, from issuing crucial public protections like this rule to restrict forced arbitration. I urge Congress to support the CFPB arbitration rule and vote against the Regulatory Accountability Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. I now introduce Penny Dryden.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My name is Penny Dryden, and I am the Executive Director of Community Housing and Empowerment Connections, Inc. And I am the chairperson of the Delaware Branch NAACP Housing Committee. And I was asked to speak today as an affiliate member of the Delaware Concerned Residents for Environmental Justice. Our mission is to inform and empower communities to take action to protect their rights to clean air, water, land, and food. The Regulatory Accountability Act would create significant blocks to our rights by making it nearly impossible for agencies like the EPA, whose very work is to protect clean air, water, or vulnerable communities, create regulations to protect communities, therefore must oppose the RAA. I grew up in a small environmental justice community right outside of the city of Wilmington, Delaware, whose residents are predominantly Black, low income, have cancer risks that are 19 to 23% higher than more affluent communities. Respiratory health risks in my community is 32 to 43% higher than Delaware overall. People there did not know that their homes, schools, and playgrounds were built on top of filled marsh and near toxic plants that are detrimental to their health and the health of their children. I now understand why my father died of pancreatic cancer. My 81-year-old mother, who suffers with breast cancer. And I'm a two-time survivor of breast cancer at 19 and colon cancer at 58. I am now 60 years old. I am cancer-free, thank God. In addition to having the second highest cancer and respiratory hazard risks within 1 mile, there are 48 brownfield sites. More than half of all brownfields in Delaware. Also within 1 mile are 2 risk management program facilities, 13 toxic release inventory facilities, and 4 Superfund sites. Our communities must remain informed and protected. Deregulation or rolling back of the risk management plan rule on chemical facilities that allow communities like mine to be aware of the dangerous chemicals lurking in our backyards is unjust. This deregulatory push must be stopped. The lack of strong regulation on air pollution to local plants and industrial facilities will leave many communities like Rosegate, right outside of Wilmington, Delaware, and others more susceptible to asthma and respiratory illnesses. Legislation like the RAA would make it even harder for our communities to get the protection we need from polluters and industry bad actors. Therefore, I strongly urge the U.S. Senate, Delaware delegation Senators Carper and Coons to stand with us protect us by voting down the Regulatory Accountability Act. What we want, our communities in northern Newcastle County want a policy approach to address, or that addresses a remedy for addressing exposure to both indoor and outdoor air toxics. We support changes in development and land use policies, permits, and practices that include addressing cumulative impacts, building materials made for housing, healthcare facilities and school settings, including a plan for addressing the threats of sea level rise. Overall, we want proactive mitigation plans that would protect us from chemical, natural disasters, and climate-induced disasters. More, we want to be part of the process because we hold solutions. We believe in the beloved communities. That includes healthy and just employment located along a healthy coast. That is what we are organized and standing for, not deregulation like RAA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny. I now introduce Dr. Paul Brooks.
Well, I want to pass my gratitude for being able to speak to this conference that's terribly important. My name is Dr. Paul Brooks. I've been a physician in Parkersburg, West Virginia for over 40 years. And for over 10 years, I've been deeply involved with the discovery of the C8 contamination and the ongoing discoveries of human diseases that C8 has been linked to in humans. When C8 was discovered in the water supply in the Middle Ohio Valley, people in the area were shocked. This occurred early in this century. DuPont, the people trusted DuPont to be forthcoming about the situation, and they were not. DuPont vehemently claimed publicly that C8 was harmless in humans. And if it were not for outside regulation, thousands of residents of the Parkersburg area would still be exposed to unsafe water and would have never known it. That is why we must have independent regulation. Obviously, self-regulation doesn't work. As a result of DuPont's decades-long cover-up of the science behind the C8 and the contamination in the Ohio River and the water supplies in 6 water districts that exceeded that regulatory level at that time, lawsuits were filed, the C8 Health Project was accomplished, and the extent of the diseases that were linked to C8 were exposed. Thousands of people in my community have been sickened by C8 dumped in our water by DuPont. We now know that C8 exposure is linked to cancer, ulcerative colitis, and other serious diseases. But without regulation, the danger of C8 may have never been known. The data collection in the C8 Health Project began in July of 2005 and was accomplished by June 2006. We collected data from nearly 70,000 residents that were exposed to the water there on at least a 1-year continuous basis. Independent epidemiologists of national and international claim gave indications that there were links to human diseases were likely, but they could not make their final determination until all the data that they were required to find and look at, including the large collection, was examined and the results known. In early 2012, the epidemiologists released a final report naming 6 diseases with probable links to C8 exposure. Meanwhile, DuPont claimed we acted responsibly, even after that was proven to be a lie. The water supplies of Parkersburg, 12 million gallons a day, in Vienna, where I now live, 1 million gallons a day, were lower than the EPA non-enforceable advisory of short-term level, which was 30 days or less. This was the beginning of the class action lawsuit in 2000, and it was settled in 2005. The population felt safe because they generally believed that the advisory level was not exceeded. Trial results in federal court, which recently ended this past spring, part of them, the discovery of the extent of DuPont's decades-long cover-up of the science, and now Chemours' contamination of the area with another chemical, which is another fluorocarbon named Gen X, has led to the community to hold a different attitude towards DuPont. Then more contamination was discovered in my town of Vienna. In the spring of 2006, discoveries of contaminations of C8 in New York, New Jersey, Vermont, EPA reduced its advisory level, and this was their first advisory level that was long-term exposure, and drinking water to 0.07 parts per billion. That is pretty dilute. Parkersburg water is still below that recommended level, but Vienna's was not, so panic set in immediately. The announcement was made on Wednesday and Thursday. The City Council of Vienna met, closed the schools, restaurants, and advised citizens and people who supplied water, like residents, demanded or directed that they use bottled water. There was a run on bottled water. Guards had to be placed around the trucks that brought in water that you could go and collect from a large tanker truck. And they had to place guards at those trucks. Chemours paid for the filtering of the Vienna water and supplied bottled water for free. DuPont had passed off their name and divided it into, and Chemours is now the entity. Since this past fall, C8 is not detectable in the Vienna water. Parkersburg has declared its water safe because it's still under the EPA advisory levels of the 0.07 parts per billion. Recent Parkersburg analysis confirmed levels of that, or below that, but without regulation, Vienna and many other communities would still be drinking contaminated water to this day. Vienna's reaction mirrors other areas in the U.S. and Europe. When informed that a proven toxic chemical has contaminated them without previous knowledge, and then informed it can cause deadly diseases, communities become upset and angry. The following news that we carried to Dordrecht in the Netherlands caused now an initial criminal investigation by the Netherlands Parliament, which is now ongoing. In Wilmington, Delaware, North Carolina, Chemours is being held accountable for dumping Gen X, the replacement chemical that I mentioned for C8, into the local water supply that's got a lot of national attention. So we are in contact with communities across the country that are dealing with C8 or other fluorocarbons contamination in New York, Vermont, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Its discovery in Parkersburg, C8 contamination now recognized as a national and international health issue. Every human being on this planet will test positive for C8. My impression at the present is that today a high percentage of citizens of the Parkersburg area believe that C8 is a threat to their health. DuPont is responsible, and DuPont has abandoned the area. DuPont was not forthcoming. It took years for Parkersburg to know the truth. As a result, Parkersburg residents are under constant threat of developing disease and have daily concerns. If our government doesn't protect us, who will? In conclusion, without meaningful regulation, none of the contamination would have been discovered. no one in my community would have found out about the harmful effects of C8. DuPont would have walked away from the largest worldwide contamination of a toxic substance untainted and untouched. Legislation cannot be allowed to hinder proper and timely regulation. Bills like RAA should not be passed by Congress. If it is passed, what happened in Parkersburg will continue to happen again and again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brooks. I would now like to introduce Chrissy Christopherson from Bend, Oregon.
Hello. Thank you to the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. My name is Chrissy Christopherson. I'm from Bend, Oregon, and I'm here today to tell you about what happened to my son, Beck. Food that we assumed was healthy ended up being the worst thing we could have given our child, and that's something that no parent should have to face. Back in 2007, Beck was just under a year old, and one of his favorite foods was a puffed rice snack with kale and spinach seasoning. We never imagined that something that seemed so wholesome would make our child so sick. When Beck began having diarrhea, we thought it was just the flu. After 3 days, it became a painful ordeal to change every diaper. We took Beck to our physician for an exam, and our doctor noticed a severe diaper rash had developed from blood and mucus in his diaper. They soon discovered the presence of Salmonella Wandsworth, an uncommon bacteria that infects mostly children. About 4 weeks after Beck tested positive for Salmonella, the public health department told us the cause of the illness. Across the country, 55 people had been infected in the same outbreak, with an average victim age of just 16 months. They determined that a vegetable seasoning from China was the culprit, after finding nothing when testing more common infant and toddler food. Beck was sick for 10 days, and though we haven't faced any ongoing health problems yet, we know we may face problems in the future because the bacteria infected Beck's 10-month-old digestive system at such a young, developing age. People assume that if a product is being sold on the shelves, it's fine and there must be some inspector out there making sure it's okay. But in reality, contaminated foods frequently slip through the cracks without being recalled. Our food safety system needs to be strengthened, but the Regulatory Accountability Act would make it more difficult for agencies like the Food and Drug Administration to ensure that the food we feed our children is safe. In 2011, the Food Safety Modernization Act authorized the FDA to issue additional regulatory protections to prevent contaminated food and respond to outbreaks, but the RAA would stop these new protections in their tracks. The Regulatory Accountability Act would add dozens of cumbersome new requirements to the rulemaking process and require that agencies like the FDA put corporate profits ahead of public health and safety when developing new regulations. The legislation would also give corporate lobbyists and lawyers dozens of new ways to dilute, delay, and defeat public protections. There's a reason people are calling the RAA the Filthy Food Act, and that's because it would make our food less safe. It's bad for consumers, bad for our families, and dangerous to our children. According to the Centers for Disease Control, every year about 48 million Americans get sick, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die from eating contaminated food. These contaminants claim the lives of dozens of children every year. I have personally met many families who have lost loved ones due to preventable foodborne illnesses. Our family was lucky in our experience that it did not result in losing our child. No one should have to go through that. Lawmakers should vote against the Regulatory Accountability Act and should instead work on making our food supply safer, rather than undermining the agencies that are supposed to ensure our kids don't get salmonella the way Beck did. I have a message for Senator Rob Portman, the lead sponsor of the RAA, and all the other senators and members of Congress who've signed on to the bill as co-sponsors. The RAA would block life-saving public protections and let big corporations rig the rules. Please reconsider your support for this dangerous legislation. No parent should have to go through what we went through. We need to do everything we can to make sure that what happened to my family doesn't happen to anyone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chrissy. I now introduce Mr. Timothy Frink from Hollywood, Maryland.
My name is Timothy Frink. I have 5 children. I have 5 grandchildren. I have another one on the way, and I have one that we lost. Our precious Brianna, who died at age 3 due to strangulation by a Venetian blind cord 5 years ago. In general, I've always thought that I was in favor of limited government regulation of our personal lives and our businesses. But after hearing these panelists, I'm drastically reconsidering my position. I truly believe no business has the right to police their own safety standards decade after decade while children continue to needlessly die on products that meet the exact standards that the industry has deemed to be safe. If an industry has the technology but refuses to design out hazards, there must be restraint, there must be regulation, and there must be controls to keep these big businesses from destroying our children's lives so needlessly. Please help us by opposing this regulation, the Regulatory Accountability Act, that will make it difficult or impossible for sensible protections that will save lives, prevent injury, to become law. We should not do anything that will tie the hands of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which is charged with protecting our children from unsafe products. My daughter Christiana and her husband Christopher were military police officers in January of 2011 when they received orders to return to Iraq. It would be Chris's 3rd tour and Christy's 2nd tour. They had 2 precious little girls at this time, Brianna, who was almost 2 years old, and Alexis, who was 7 months old. Our families all agreed to have the grandchildren stay with the 2 sets of grandparents while our kids went off to Iraq in 2011. At first, I couldn't believe they wanted to leave their children behind and go off to war together and serve at the same time, but they thought it would be less stressful on their marriage and their family by leaving the children with us. It turned out to be a great year in our lives, a year we'll never forget, having those precious children with us. You know, parenting young grandchildren can be real challenging for any grandparent, as some of you already may know. Their energy, their emotions, and challenges can really stretch grandparents. But reliving those early years when our own girls were so small was a tremendous delight and well worth the challenges we faced. Here are a couple of entries in my journal from that year when our little girls lived with us. Brianna, you were so good with words and expressing yourself at such a young age. You always amaze us with your delightful expressions, and I'll never forget that time when you were driving to the top of the bridge in Solomon's Island, and you look out at the age of 2, and beholding the beautiful view of the Patuxent River and the Chesapeake Bay, you threw out your arms and proclaimed, "It's amazing," which is what we always say when we drive over that bridge, but you don't expect a 2-year-old to be saying that. I could share story after story of our precious Brianna while she was living with us. But when Christopher and Christy returned from Iraq in December of 2011, we were very thankful for their safe return. The family was reunited and moved back to Clarksville, Tennessee, where they were stationed. And it was on July 10th, 5 years ago, that we received the horrible news that our granddaughter, Brianna, had been strangled to death by a blind cord in the upstairs den. It was a simple thing. You never would even think it could possibly happen to you and your family. Matter of fact, our kids, they had installed these heavy-duty blinds from a big box store, and they had specifically cut the cords because it was recommended. Don't have those really long cords, which are like 10 feet long. Bring them up so that they're not on the floor, so that they can't cause a danger, and they had done that. But unfortunately, about a year later, they'd redone the furniture in the upstairs den, and they pushed the couch up against the wall with the blinds behind, not even realizing that was a deadly danger. So on that day, Brianna had put on her little bride outfit and coaxed her daddy into marrying her again with mommy officiating. It was one of her favorite pretend games. Then daddy went to his job on the base, and Chrissy took the day off to spend with the girls. And later that day, Chrissy was cooking dinner, and Brianna was upstairs watching a program in the den. And Chrissy heard it go really quiet, and she hadn't heard Brianna jumping or squealing with delight, and so she went up to investigate. And you cannot imagine the shock and the horror that Christy felt when she went upstairs and discovered Brianna hanging there, strangled to death by this blind cord. Christy was a medical technician, and she tried to do CPR, but it was too late. Brianna was gone. The impact upon our kids and our family was beyond words. You never fully recover from the sudden death of a child. Christopher retired from disability from the Army due to PTSD and the very serious injuries he had suffered in Iraq to his knees. Christiana suffered from severe PTSD from her war experiences and the devastating loss of her precious little princess. And she too lost her Army career and is now retired on disability. And 5 years later, she still walks with emotional scars and deep pain in her soul. And they were extremely fortunate that their love and commitment to each other was so strong that they didn't lose their marriage also, like many families that have lost a young child. You know, our children were willing to sacrifice a year of their lives with their two little children, and they were willing to lay down their own lives because they believed in America. They believed in protecting America from death and destruction. And it's a terrible irony and a shame that Brianna had to be killed in her own home, which should be a safe haven. For the last 40 years, window covering manufacturers have known that their products are killing our children, and yet they've been unwilling to stop production and sacrifice their products. We survived this horrible experience, but our family will never be the same. You see, we not only lost our own granddaughter, but we felt we lost our own little girl because she had lived with us that year. We've all been broken by one of the most heart-wrenching events any family can experience. And we are heartsick that this industry continues to pass through their safety testing procedures corded window products that threaten children's play and sleep environments. Many tenants, including those in HUD housing, military soldiers, they have no choice on what window coverings are in their homes. Their children sleep and play in an environment that are made unsafe by lethal cords in the homes and preschools. And it seems wherever I go into people's homes, and there's these Venetian blind cords everywhere. And it's one of my missions to say, do you know that my granddaughter died on a product just like this? And I don't care that you got it hung up here. It could come down in an instant and kill your child in 30 seconds. Every single one of these corded products has a cost-effective cordless alternative. And children have been strangled on cords with safety cleats, with breakaway cords, with loops that have been tied down with tensioners, that have broken away from walls, and other failed safety devices that unsuspecting parents have trusted as child safe. You know, I truly believe the Regulatory Accountability Act is misnamed. It really should be the Regulatory Unaccountability Act, because it is allowing these companies to be unaccountable for their actions and not have to follow proper procedures and testing in order to have safe products for our own benefit. It will allow companies to produce products that are the least costly or most cost-effective, rather than products that maximize net benefits to the public. That seems backwards. What's more important, corporate profits or the lives of our children and our family members? It just doesn't make sense to me. I urge everyone to remember our story and to oppose the RAA that'll make it harder for the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission to prevent other families from suffering as we have. I urge our senators and our president to oppose this act and any other legislation that will make more difficult for agencies to fulfill their missions and protect children and their families. This Regulatory Accountability Act will make it almost impossible to force businesses to properly value all human life, and especially to cease making child-killing products.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frank, I now introduce Mr. Miles Harrison from Percival, Virginia.
Almost 9 years ago, it was a typical day of getting everyone up and ready to head out the door, as well as myself to work on time. Like so many parents, I was multitasking, getting my child ready, making sure we had everything packed, and rushing around with the typical morning business. My world changed forever that day. When I went into my office that day, I was focused on fixing all the problems at work because that was my job. The day flew by. I went to lunch with my boss to fill him in on the status of my work. It was the only break of the day. Then, having no idea what time it was, a colleague came into my office and said, "Hey, do you have a doll in your car?" Stunned, I had no idea why he would ask such a question and couldn't imagine what he was talking about. I stood up and started to go through what I had done that day and then realized, oh my God, no. No, God, no. I rushed to the car, and as I came upon the side window, I saw Chase. I had not dropped him off at daycare, as I had intended. I ripped open the car door, pulled him from the car seat, unaware of anyone around, and ran into my office with him in my arms, screaming and crying and calling out for help. It was too late. I was so distraught, upset, and completely incapacitated excuse me, that I spent hours in the ER. The nurse offered me painkillers to help me feel better, but I refused and said I did not deserve not to feel the pain. Without any compassion, the police demanded that I be brought to the police station and interviewed immediately. The detective started asking all sorts of questions, like, do you have life insurance on your son? It started to hit me. I had killed my son. My poor, sweet little boy. God, take me now and return him to his beautiful mother. Please, God, not him, me. I had to be hospitalized for several weeks and even registered under a fake name because I would have been arrested the moment I left the hospital. Tragically, I was not even allowed to attend my son's funeral. My story continues with a very public trial, fighting a charge of involuntary manslaughter, of which, thank God, I was found not guilty after 3 days in the courtroom. It really didn't matter to me whether I was found guilty or innocent. I considered myself guilty and full of shame. I cry every day for Chase. I still have not forgiven myself and don't know if I have the capacity to do so. I look at my wife in amazement. She has never wavered. She has stayed with me, and we are still together. She is the most beautiful and wonderful wife in the world. After the trial, Gene Weingarten wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning article titled Fatal Distraction about parents who have gone through what my family went through. He somehow was able to capture the essence of how otherwise wonderful parents could be involved in a parent's worst nightmare. He was able to explain this modern-day phenomena in a way people could understand and relate. The death of our precious baby boy became an international incident. The Russian government banned all adoptions of American children and named the law after my son Chase. We were bombarded with news articles written about what a terrible person I am and how this could never happen to responsible people. But frankly, the daily beating I give to myself is far more brutal than anything I have ever read about myself on the internet. This did not have to happen. If there had been a simple chime to alert me of my son's presence, none of this would have happened. How can this be? That in this great country, it is not mandatory that the simplest alarm not be required in all cars. Children are dying unnecessarily. Families are being destroyed unnecessarily. This has got to stop. We need to pass a law that will set in motion a process to finalize a regulation to require a charm or other reminder to prevent other families from experiencing this tragedy. We already have our work cut out for us. Passing a regulation is hard and takes a long time. Kidsincars.org has been trying for 15 years to get this technology added to vehicles, unsuccessfully. It's already close to impossible to make these types of changes, but if a bill called the Regulatory Accountability Act, or RAA, is passed and becomes law, it would virtually be impossible for a rule like this to ever be implemented. It would also prevent rules from being implemented to prevent other safety problems that harm children and adults in cars and involving other products. The RAA will require so much analysis, will require an adversarial system, and will not sufficiently take into account the vast benefits of life-saving rules, such as a rule that could have saved my son Chase. In our son Chase's honor, we have made it our mission to try to prevent this unspeakable tragedy from happening to any parents. Every time we hear of another child dying, we relive that horrible day with them all over, and we ask why. Why does this keep happening when there is technology available to prevent it? Every loving, caring parent must realize that this disaster could happen to them. They need to be aware of this phenomena and make sure that rules that would save lives, such as a rule to mandate a vehicle alarm system to save the lives of our children and eliminating the crushing pain this causes their parents, can be implemented. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. It takes tremendous strength and courage to turn these personal and community tragedies into advocacy. Every one of these families, of these individuals, very much could turn inward and suffer silently and internally, and yet all of these folks have chosen to be out there publicly to prevent others from suffering the harms that they are suffering. And please join me in expressing awe and appreciation to them. I now would like to open the floor to questions. Please identify yourself before you choose to ask your question.
I'm Mark Gruenberg. I run Press Associates Union News Service. Just one comment on the C8, and then I'll ask the question. I remember, I've been around long enough to remember when the United Steelworkers had to deal with a big C8 PFOA problem. I think it was in Oklahoma, so you might want to contact them for aid and analysis there. Now the question is, one of you mentioned Senator Portman is the lead sponsor of the RAA. Obviously, this thing is kicking through Congress or going through Congress. Have any of you had a chance to talk with your lawmakers? And if so, what responses or lack of them have you gotten?
Well, we are actually meeting with our members of Congress and their members of Congress later today, and we've had a series of meetings and lobby days from all different communities. A consumer lobby day and other communities have had lobby days communicating with their members of Congress with various results, depending, I would say, on where where they are. However, we've been heartened that more senators have not gotten onto the bill, and it's incredibly important for these folks to communicate their stories. Dr. Brooks, do you want to respond?
Well, it's hard to recall how much has gone on in the past few years, but since we established a website, DuPont Keep Your Promises, we have sent at least 2 or 3 communications to all of the city, county, state, and national representatives in the state of West Virginia and Ohio, because Ohio, actually 5 of the 6 water districts that became prominent in the class action suit are in Ohio. They're on the western side of the river, and we're on and Lubeck, which is the other, on the eastern side. I hate to admit it, but essentially no results. I don't think, and I'd have to go back to the central office of DuPont Keep Your Promises, but we may have knowledge that they got it. We received your communication, but nothing, to the best of my knowledge, has ever been done. Of course, locally, I've been, fairly active from time to time, but, let's put it this way. We would have never had the water in Vienna, which is a small distribution, 1 million gallons a day, had it not been for the EPA dropping that advisory level that created the panic I alluded to. It would have never occurred, and we'd still be drinking the same contaminated water that was established at, I think, 0.1 most areas in New York and Vermont, et cetera. So we're going to have to try to get enough mass, if you will, critical mass, to bring, meaningful regulation to this terrible chemical. And it's not only the United States, it's worldwide, okay?
And I would just like to add that there are many false narratives being perpetuated about the need for regulatory reform. With the RAA, one specific false narrative is that it's procedural, it merely amends a 40-year-old law that needs to be changed. That could not be further from the truth. And the stories we've heard today, the real-world consequences of making it even harder to regulate are the strongest response to that false narrative. And that's what we'll be talking to senators about today. Any other questions before we close? Okay, well, I thank you very much for your time, and the speakers will be available for one-on-one interviews after this briefing ends today. Thank you very much.